On the moonless night of November 12, 1942, Commander Hara Tameichi stood on the bridge of the destroyer Amatsukaze as it sliced through the waters north of Guadalcanal at 28 knots. The warm South Pacific air carried the salt spray across his face, and visibility extended barely 300 meters in the pitch darkness. He smiled with confidence, knowing that his crew had trained for years in night combat operations, perfecting techniques that made the Imperial Japanese Navy the undisputed master of nocturnal warfare. What Commander Hara could not possibly know was that his opponent could already see him from 18,000 meters away, tracking his every move through a technology he did not even know existed. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one invisible technology transformed naval warfare overnight, turning the world's most elite night-fighting force into prey, and how dozens of skilled commanders went to their graves, never understanding what had defeated them. Commander Hara had every reason for his confidence that November night. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested over a decade in perfecting night combat tactics that no other navy in the world could match. Their Type 93 long-lance torpedoes could strike targets from over 20,000 meters away, traveling at 49 knots with warheads containing 490 kilograms of explosive. Their optical equipment was the finest available, with massive binoculars that could detect ships in starlight conditions where American lookouts saw only darkness. Most importantly, their crews had undergone endless drilling in night operations, learning to fight by starlight, to communicate by subtle light signals, and to maneuver in perfect coordination without breaking radio silence. The Americans, by contrast, had largely neglected night combat training before the conflict. Their doctrine emphasized daylight engagements, where superior firepower and industrial capacity would prevail. Japanese naval officers studied after-action reports from early encounters with smug satisfaction. In engagement after engagement during the opening months around Guadalcanal, Japanese forces had savaged American ships that blundered into night encounters. The operations at Savo Island in August had been particularly devastating, with 4 Allied heavy cruisers sent to the bottom in less than an hour of combat. The American survivors spoke in hushed tones of how Japanese ships seemed to materialize from the darkness like ghosts, launching perfectly aimed torpedoes and salvos before vanishing again into the night. Lieutenant Commander Yasuo Fujimori, gunnery officer aboard the destroyer Asagumo, had participated in that August engagement. He remembered the chaos on the American vessels as his ship's searchlights suddenly illuminated them at close range. The enemy crews had been completely unprepared, their ships positioned without any awareness of Japanese forces, closing to point-blank range. Fujimori had written to his wife afterward, expressing pride in the superior training and night vision of Japanese sailors. He noted that American lookouts seemed half-blind in darkness, unable to spot ships until searchlights revealed them. What neither Hara nor Fujimori understood was that while they had been perfecting human senses and traditional optical equipment, American engineers had been developing something that would make those advantages irrelevant. Deep in laboratories at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington and at facilities run by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, scientists had been working on radio detection and ranging, a technology that could locate ships through radio waves even in complete darkness or through thick fog. By November 1942, these devices had been installed on major American warships, but their existence remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the conflict. The technology worked by sending out radio pulses and measuring the time it took for them to bounce back from solid objects. A trained operator could determine not just the presence of a ship, but its precise range, bearing, and even its course and speed. The device could detect vessels at distances that exceeded even the best optical equipment on the brightest moonlit night. More importantly, it could do this in conditions where human eyes were completely useless. Rear Admiral Willis Lee, commanding American battleships during the November actions, had received extensive briefing on the capabilities and limitations of the new equipment. He understood that he possessed an advantage that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of naval combat. His ships could detect, track, and fire upon enemy vessels that had no idea they were even being observed. Lee was a thoughtful officer, a champion marksman who understood the importance of seeing your target before your target saw you. He had realized immediately that this technology would transform night combat from a test of seamanship and traditional skills into something entirely different. On the night of November 14th, Lee positioned his force northwest of Guadalcanal, placing his battleships Washington and South Dakota at the center of his formation. His detection equipment began picking up contacts at ranges exceeding 18,000 meters, while Japanese lookouts strained to see anything in the darkness. Lee watched the glowing scopes, seeing the geometry of the approaching enemy force displayed with perfect clarity. He could track individual ships, determine their formation, and plan his response while remaining completely undetected. Commander Hara, approaching with a force of destroyers and battleships, had no indication that he had already been found. His lookouts scanned the darkness with superb optical equipment. His radiomen maintained strict silence, avoiding any transmission that might give away their position. His ships moved in the precise formations that years of training had perfected. Everything was being executed exactly according to doctrine, with the professionalism that had made the Imperial Navy feared throughout the Pacific. The range closed to 15,000 meters, then 12,000. On the American ships, plotting teams marked the enemy positions with growing precision. Gun directors trained toward targets that lookouts could not yet see. The Americans maintained their own radio silence, but they could track and coordinate through their detection equipment without emitting signals the Japanese could intercept. It was like watching prey through a one-way window. At 9,000 meters, some of the sharper-eyed Japanese lookouts finally reported visual contact, though the contacts were vague and uncertain in the darkness. Hara felt satisfaction that his crews had spotted the enemy at what he considered good range for night conditions. He had no way of knowing that his opponents had been watching him for the last 15 minutes, had already calculated firing solutions, and were preparing to engage at their convenience rather than his. When the American battleship Washington opened fire at 8,400 meters, the shells seemed to come from nowhere. One moment, Hara's force was approaching what they believed to be an enemy formation they had just detected. The next moment, massive 33-centimeter shells were falling around them with uncanny accuracy. Despite the complete darkness and the fact that no searchlights had been activated, the Japanese doctrine called for searchlight use during the final attack phase, but the Americans were somehow firing with precision while remaining in complete darkness themselves. The battleship Kirishima, pride of the Japanese force, took hit after hit. The American gunnery was inexplicable. In darkness, where Japanese doctrine said accurate fire should be nearly impossible without searchlight illumination, the American shells were falling with daylight precision. Kirishima's superstructure was wrecked, her steering damaged, fires breaking out throughout the vessel. Within 7 minutes of the first American salvo, she was effectively defeated, dead in the water and listing heavily. Commander Fujimori, watching from his destroyer, could not comprehend what he was witnessing. The Americans were maintaining fire control on multiple ships simultaneously in conditions where Japanese doctrine said it should be nearly impossible to track even one target accurately. His own ship attempted to close for torpedo attack, the weapon system that had served the Imperial Navy so well in previous night actions. But before they could reach effective launch range, American destroyers that Fujimori had not even known were present opened fire with devastating accuracy. The confusion on Japanese ships was total. Officers who had trained their entire careers in night combat found all their expertise useless. Ships that should have been invisible were being tracked and engaged from ranges that exceeded anything in Japanese experience. Attempts to use searchlights to illuminate targets only resulted in those ships immediately receiving concentrated fire, as if the Americans knew exactly where each Japanese ship was the moment it revealed itself. Lieutenant Koji Watanabe, a junior officer aboard the destroyer Ayanami, later wrote in his diary about the sense of fighting blind against an opponent who could see perfectly. He described how his ship maneuvered desperately, how lookouts shouted contradictory reports, how the captain ordered course changes trying to evade fire from sources they could not locate. The entire doctrine of night combat, the techniques that had been drilled into every officer and sailor, seemed to have stopped working. American ships were somehow tracking them through the darkness with impossible precision. Ayanami took multiple hits and eventually had to be abandoned. As Watanabe clung to debris in the oil-slicked water, waiting for rescue, he wondered what had happened. The Americans had fought with a coordination and accuracy that seemed supernatural. They had tracked multiple ships simultaneously, maintained fire even as targets maneuvered, and done it all without the searchlight illumination that Japanese doctrine said was essential. Nothing in his training had prepared him for an enemy that could fight in total darkness as if it were broad daylight. The November engagements were not isolated incidents. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, a pattern emerged that left Japanese commanders increasingly frustrated and confused. Night after night, American ships demonstrated capabilities that seemed impossible. They could detect approaching forces at ranges that exceeded Japanese visual acquisition. They could track ships through rain squalls and total darkness. They could coordinate complex maneuvers without breaking radio silence. Captain Toshio Abe, commanding a cruiser force in late November, experienced this firsthand when his formation approached what intelligence had reported as a lone American destroyer. Abe planned a classic night engagement, approaching from multiple angles to trap the enemy vessel. His ships maintained perfect radio discipline, moved in practiced coordination, and closed in what should have been a perfectly executed pincer movement. Instead, before his formation could spring the trap, American cruisers that intelligence had not even reported as being in the area opened fire with perfect accuracy. Abe's flagship took hits within the first minute of engagement. Two of his destroyers were struck almost simultaneously. The Americans were somehow aware of his entire formation, tracking each ship individually and concentrating fire with devastating efficiency. Abe survived the encounter, but wrote a lengthy report expressing his confusion. The Americans, he noted, fought as if they possessed some form of magic eye that could see through darkness and weather. Their gunnery was far too accurate for optical fire control in the conditions present. Their awareness of Japanese ship positions exceeded anything that should have been possible with conventional reconnaissance. He speculated that perhaps the Americans had developed some new form of aerial reconnaissance using silent aircraft, though he acknowledged this was merely a guess to explain the inexplicable. What Abe and other Japanese commanders did not know was that by late November, the Americans had refined their use of the detection technology to an art form. Operators had learned to distinguish between different ship types from the characteristics of their returns. Plotting teams could track multiple contacts simultaneously and vector friendly ships to optimal attack positions. Commanders like Admiral Lee had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the technology's advantages, positioning their forces to maximize detection range while minimizing their own visual signature. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was profound. Sailors who had taken pride in their superior night combat training found their skills meaningless. Lookouts who had spent years developing exceptional night vision discovered they could not compete against an enemy who seemingly could see perfectly in total darkness. The confidence that had characterized Japanese night operations began to erode, replaced by a growing sense of fighting against an opponent who possessed an unfair advantage they could not understand or counter. Ensign Haruki Sato, serving aboard the destroyer Kawakaze, described in a letter to his family the growing dread among the crew before night operations. Men who had previously approached night encounters with confidence now showed visible nervousness. They knew they were effective sailors with good training and excellent equipment, but they also knew that somehow the Americans could see them while they remained blind. It was like fighting an opponent who could read your mind, Sato wrote. You could execute perfect tactics, maintain flawless discipline, and still find yourself under accurate fire from sources you had not even detected. The American advantage was not absolute. The detection equipment had limitations. It could not see through land masses, which meant Japanese ships could sometimes use islands for concealment. It had trouble distinguishing closely spaced ships, which meant tight formations could sometimes confuse the displays. It required skilled operators who could interpret the glowing returns and distinguish between actual ships and false signals caused by rain or sea conditions. Japanese forces occasionally achieved tactical successes, particularly when they could use terrain to mask their approach, or when they stumbled into American formations at close range where visual detection became possible. But these occasions became increasingly rare as American operators gained experience, and commanders learned to use the technology effectively. By December 1942, the pattern was clear. In night engagements where American ships possessed the detection equipment and used it properly, they held an overwhelming advantage. Japanese forces that had dominated the early months around Guadalcanal found themselves increasingly on the defensive, suffering losses they could not explain and victories they could not achieve. Commander Hara survived the November battles and continued to serve throughout the campaign. In his post-war memoir, he wrote extensively about the confusion and frustration of those months. He described how Japanese commanders developed increasingly elaborate theories to explain American capabilities. Some believed the Americans had developed a new form of infrared detection equipment that could see in darkness. Others speculated about advanced acoustic systems that could locate ships by engine noise. A few even wondered if American ships had been equipped with advanced optical devices supplied by the British, who were known for excellent naval equipment. None of these theories came close to the truth. The concept of radio waves being used for detection was so far outside Japanese experience and understanding that it simply did not occur to them as a possibility. Japanese scientists were aware of the basic principles that would enable such technology, but the Imperial Navy had not prioritized its development. The assumption had been that traditional methods of detection, refined to the highest possible level, would remain the standard for naval combat. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The impact extended beyond individual engagements. The American ability to locate and track Japanese supply runs to Guadalcanal, even at night when such operations should have been relatively safe, made it increasingly difficult to sustain forces on the island. Destroyers running supplies down what the Americans called the Tokyo Express route found themselves intercepted with disturbing frequency. Even when these fast warships made their runs at night, even when they maintained strict radio silence and took circuitous routes, American forces somehow managed to position themselves for interception. Lieutenant Commander Shunsaku Kudo, participating in several of these supply runs, described the growing sense of futility. His ship would depart from base with vital supplies and equipment, race down the slot at maximum speed under cover of darkness, and still find American ships waiting in ambush positions that suggested they had known the Japanese route and timing in advance. Kudo noted that while his crew maintained excellent discipline and his ship performed flawlessly, they were somehow being detected and tracked through methods he could not understand. The material losses were significant. By the time Japanese forces finally evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, they had lost dozens of ships in night actions they had expected to dominate. More importantly, they had lost the psychological advantage that came from superior night combat capabilities. Japanese crews that had once approached darkness with confidence now faced it with trepidation. American sailors, conversely, gained growing confidence in their technological edge, even though many of them did not fully understand the devices that made it possible. Interestingly, the Japanese came closest to understanding the truth, not through combat experience, but through technical intelligence. In late December 1942, Japanese forces recovered debris from a destroyed American aircraft that included fragments of airborne detection equipment. Engineers examining these fragments realized they were looking at a radio-based detection system, though they initially believed it was primarily for aircraft navigation rather than ship detection. A few far-sighted officers speculated that similar technology might be installed on ships, but this intelligence was not widely distributed or acted upon. Part of the problem was institutional. The Imperial Navy had invested tremendous resources and prestige in traditional night combat methods. Admitting that these methods had been rendered obsolete by a foreign technology would have been professionally and culturally difficult. It was easier to attribute American success to luck, to superior numbers, to better intelligence networks, or to any number of conventional explanations rather than acknowledge that the fundamental assumptions of naval combat had changed. Even officers who suspected the truth found it difficult to convince their superiors. Commander Torajiro Sato, a technical staff officer, submitted a report in January 1943 arguing that American ships must possess some form of electronic detection equipment that operated independently of light. He based this conclusion on the statistical improbability of American gunnery accuracy in the conditions where engagements had occurred. His report was filed and largely ignored. The idea seemed too radical, too far from accepted understanding of how naval combat worked. By mid-1943, American detection technology had been installed on most major surface combatants and had been continuously improved based on operational experience. The device that had been experimental and temperamental in early 1942 had become reliable and effective. Operators had developed techniques for tracking multiple contacts, vectoring aircraft, detecting periscopes, and dozens of other applications. The Americans had moved from having an experimental advantage to possessing mature technology that fundamentally altered naval warfare. Japanese forces continued to fight with skill and determination, but they were fighting with a fundamental disadvantage they still did not fully understand. Some commanders adapted by avoiding night engagements when possible, by using terrain for concealment, or by attempting to close to ranges where visual detection would occur simultaneously for both sides. These tactics had limited success. The fundamental mathematics of detection range versus engagement range had changed, and no amount of traditional skill could overcome the disadvantage of being seen before you could see. The human cost was significant. Thousands of Japanese sailors perished in night engagements where they were at a disadvantage they could not comprehend. Ships were sent to the bottom by accurate fire from opponents they had not detected. Skilled officers and experienced crews were lost because their training and equipment, however excellent, were no longer sufficient. Men died confused about how they had been defeated, never knowing that they had fought against a technology their navy had failed to develop. After the conclusion of hostilities, many surviving Japanese naval officers learned the truth about American detection capabilities. Commander Hara, reading technical reports about the equipment, experienced a mixture of emotions. There was relief at finally understanding what had happened during those confusing night battles around Guadalcanal. There was frustration at having fought so many engagements at such a disadvantage. There was also a certain professional respect for the technology itself and the American commanders, who had learned to use it effectively. In his writings, Hara reflected on how the Guadalcanal campaign represented a turning point, not just in the Pacific conflict, but in naval warfare itself. The era of the human eye and optical equipment as primary detection methods was ending, replaced by electronic sensors that could see through darkness, weather, and distance. The skills that the Imperial Navy had so carefully cultivated became secondary to technological capability. It was, he wrote, like watching samurai facing firearms for the first time, traditional excellence rendered insufficient by technological change. The story of Japanese forces at Guadalcanal is often told as a tale of strategic mistakes, logistical failures, or operational errors. But at its core, it was a story of technological asymmetry and the human cost of fighting with incomplete information. Skilled commanders made reasonable decisions based on incomplete understanding. Brave sailors executed their duties flawlessly while operating under false assumptions. Entire crews died confused about what had overcome them. The technology that gave American forces such an advantage around Guadalcanal would become standard on warships worldwide within a few years. The Imperial Japanese Navy would eventually develop its own versions, though they never achieved the sophistication or deployment scale of American systems. By then, the pattern had been set. Night combat would never again be primarily about human vision and traditional skills. The invisible eye of electronic detection had changed naval warfare permanently. For the men who fought around Guadalcanal in late 1942, this transformation was intensely personal. American sailors who had feared the legendary Japanese night-fighting prowess gained confidence as their technology proved its worth. Japanese sailors who had taken pride in superior training faced the bitter reality that their skills had been rendered insufficient. The psychological impact on both sides extended far beyond individual battles. The true tragedy was not just in the ships lost or the lives ended, but in the fact that so many men died without understanding why. They fought with courage and skill, executing tactics that should have worked based on everything they knew about naval combat. They maintained discipline under fire, maneuvered precisely, and used their weapons effectively. And yet they were defeated again and again by an opponent who could see them when they remained blind, who could track their movements while remaining undetected, who could coordinate attacks with a precision that seemed impossible. Commander Hara, standing on the bridge that November night in 1942, represented the finest traditions of the Imperial Navy. He was skilled, experienced, well-trained and confident. He commanded a capable ship with an excellent crew. He was approaching combat using tactics that had proven successful in previous engagements. And he was already defeated, though he would not realize it for several more minutes, because his opponent could see him from 18,000 meters away, while he saw nothing but darkness. That moment, repeated hundreds of times around Guadalcanal and throughout the Pacific, represented not just tactical defeat, but the end of an era in naval warfare. The age of the human eye and optical equipment was giving way to the age of electronics and sensors. The skills that had taken years to develop were being superseded by technologies that could be operated with months of training. The very nature of naval combat was changing, and those who failed to recognize or adapt to that change paid a terrible price. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.